psalmist said, Psalm 119, verse 105, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." The King James puts it very poetically there. God's word is to be a lamp, a way to guide us through life. And the only way it's going to guide you through life is if you read it. And the only way you're going to read it is if you know how to read it. So how do you read the Bible? You cannot read every part of the Bible the same way that you read every other part of the Bible. For example, let's think of the Old Testament, all right? Now, the Old Testament is made up of books of history, books of poetry, books of prophecy. In fact, you can remember it easily like this. Remember these numbers: 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. It's almost like a song. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. All right, you've got 5 books of law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then you've got 12 books of history: Joshua, Judges, Ruth. That gives you the historical context of how the nation of Israel was developed. And then you have 5 books of poetry: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Then you've got 5 major prophets. They're called major because they're longer. And then 12 minor prophets. That's your Old Testament: 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. You cannot, listen to me, you cannot read historical narratives like the book of Genesis and the book of 2 Samuel, for example, the way that you read the Psalms of David. The Psalms of David are written in poetry. You don't read poetry the way that you read nonfiction true crime books, okay? So you don't read prophecy. This is where a lot of people get in trouble with their sensational speculation about all this stuff that they think they know so much about. You can't read symbolic imagery in the prophets the same way that you read a historical narrative. So, for example, in Ezekiel 34 and verse 24, Ezekiel calls Jesus David. He doesn't call him Jesus. He says, "When my flock is gathered together, I will give them one shepherd, and it will be David." Now, everybody, even the premillennialists who believe that Jesus is going to come back and rule on the throne of David, they think everything in the book of Revelation has to be interpreted literally. Even they admit that's not talking about literal David, even though that's what he said. He said, "I'm going to set David over them." Well, David had been dead for a long time by then. Even they admit that's talking about Jesus. Why didn't he call him Jesus? Because they didn't know who Jesus was, but they did know who David was. So if you keep that in mind, this is a symbolic book, and he calls him Jesus. He calls him David symbolically, even though he's talking about Jesus. Well, you can't read Genesis the way that you read Ezekiel that way. So it's not talking about literal David, it's talking about Jesus. So if we keep in mind how to read different books, when you're reading the book of Job or the book of Proverbs, you don't read that the same way that you read the book of Leviticus. And by remembering that, books of law, books of history, books of poetry, books of prophecy, then the Bible will make a lot more sense to you when you realize there's different kinds of literature in it. So that's the way to read the Old Testament. Same way in the New Testament. The Old Testament can be remembered 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. 5 books of law, 12 books of history, 5 books of poetry, 5 major prophets, 12 minor prophets. They're called minor because they're shorter. They're called major because they're longer. That's the only difference. You come to the New Testament, is it that simple with the New Testament? Oh, yeah. You got 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You got 1 historical record of the church. Then you've got 21 letters written to churches, 21 epistles they're called, but they're just letters. And then you've got 1 book of apocalyptic imagery and symbolism, the book of Revelation. So 4, 1, 21, 1. 4 Gospels, 1 historical book of Acts, 21 letters, and then 1 book of prophecy, and 1 book of imagery, 1 apocalyptic narrative. You don't read the book of Revelation, an apocalyptic book of signs and symbols, the same way you read the book of Acts, which is a historical account of the early church. So remember that. When you're reading the book of Revelation, you're reading signs and symbols, and there's not a man alive today who knows what all those signs and symbols mean. Doesn't mean you can't get anything out of it. If you read it focused on Jesus to help you in your relationship with Jesus, it's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful thing to read. But when Paul writes to the Thessalonians, and says in 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10, "If anyone will not work, don't let him eat." That's plain language. That's not symbolic imagery. So that's completely different than reading about, a sea beast coming up out of the sea in Revelation 13. So a big way to help you, especially if you're a new believer and just starting to read the Bible, is to realize that there are different ways to read different parts of the Bible because they are written differently. You don't read the Gospels the same way you read the letters of Paul. And just by focusing on that simple premise a lot of confusion will be cleared up. When you go to the book of Revelation, don't try to figure out all the signs and symbols. Just read about your relationship with God. When you go to the book of Acts, then read about how the church was started. And then, of course, spend most of your time in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John about the life of Jesus. And the Bible will come alive to you when you read it correctly. Okay, it's just like any other book. There's a right way and a wrong way to read it. There are people who can explain it better, but what I've told you, there is no way that what I've told you is controversial or could lead you astray. I didn't make it up. These are things that all responsible Bible students of experience know, and so we share them with new believers. I had to be taught it when I was first starting to study the Bible. That's what we're doing with you. You will not go wrong with this kind of simplistic approach, reasonable approach to the Bible.